The British Humanist Association is currently running ads on buses that say, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." Apparently, someone was offended by this. I know, never expected that would happen. But Stephen Green of Christian Voice has filed a complaint with the Advertising Standards Authority on the grounds of truthfulness and substantiation. He said, "I believe the ad breaks the advertising code anyway, unless the advertisers hold evidence that God probably does not exist." Well, he's resurrected a classic argument here. I mean, how many times have you heard this before? An atheist says, "Hey, you can't prove there is a God," and a theist says, "But you can't prove there isn't." And a lot of people have only a very shallow understanding of what's going on here, so they just assume this argument has reached an impasse, a stalemate, and no further progress can be made because nobody knows either way. Well, that's incorrect. When someone says you can't prove there is a God, in a literal sense they are right. You can't prove there is no God. Why? Because they've defined the concept of God in such a way that it can't be proven wrong. They've defined God as being something external to the natural world, something supernatural. Therefore, it's impervious to scientific investigation or any form of reasoning based on observation. So, while they are technically correct to say you can't prove there is no God, this provides no assistance to the greater purpose of their argument, the belief that there is a God. To say that we can't disprove a concept when they've intentionally defined that concept so that it's inaccessible to the entire system of reasoning, evidence, and proof, does not serve to advance their argument whatsoever. This does not constitute a reason to believe God does exist, because you can't just try to take this shortcut past any kind of proof and then assume God exists. If I said there was a cupcake orbiting the Andromeda galaxy, and you asked me to prove it, and I said you couldn't disprove it, is there actually any reason to believe the cupcake exists? No. Should we assume the cupcake exists just because we can't prove it doesn't? Of course not. The burden of proof lies with the person making a positive claim. If I'm going to say the cupcake exists, it's my responsibility to provide actual evidence for this. It's not everyone else's responsibility to prove me wrong. Nobody is obligated to prove something doesn't exist when there's no evidence that it does exist. It's absurd to try and impose that kind of obligation on someone because it's an impossible standard to meet. You cannot prove a negative. See, if an atheist says there is no God, then if there is evidence of a God, it can be presented and they can be proven wrong. But if a theist says there is a God when there is no evidence in favor of this, then what evidence would have to be presented to prove them wrong? What evidence would constitute proof that there is no God when there's already no evidence that there is? Well, there's nothing that would satisfy these conditions. That's why it's impossible to prove a negative. And that's why the burden of proof lies with whoever is making a positive claim. There is no evidence that God exists. Until there is, it's reasonable to assume that God does not exist. And we have no obligation to provide some kind of evidence against God when there's already no evidence for God. This principle is why we do not believe in intergalactic cupcakes. This is why we should not believe in any gods. And this is why the British Humanist Association does not need to provide evidence that there's probably no God.